Alrighty, and welcome to the first and only episode of the No Name podcast. I'm going to be talking to my father, Mark Bell, about racism in Canada and how it differs from American racism, and how we can take those lessons into America today. So, do you mind just giving a short introduction of yourself?
So my name's Mark Bell. I'm a Canadian citizen who lives in the U.S. under a green card. I emigrated to the United States in 1998 and have lived here ever since. I've had a green card for almost 15 years now and keep my Canadian citizenship, and I go back once a year.
Alrighty, so let's just hop right into it. So in America, one of the primary spigots that racism spews from is the longstanding institution of slavery. So the first thing I went into research was the history of slavery and its end in Canada. So as I'm sure you knew, slavery in Canada was abolished a little bit earlier than it was in the U.S. In 1793, the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, John Graves Simcoe, passed the Act Against Slavery, making it illegal to bring slaves into the colony and mandating the gradual emancipation of all slaves in Upper Canada. Slavery was abolished in Upper Canada in 1793 by the Act Against Slavery and fully abolished in all provinces as a result of the Slavery Abolition Act, which abolished slavery throughout the British Empire in the year 1833. This actively pushed total Canadian abolition efforts at 32 years before the United States. The United States was, in fact, though, ahead of Canada in terms of provincial/state abolition, with Vermont abolishing slavery more than 20 years before the Upper Canadian Act Against Slavery. So why don't you think that the Canadian abolition of slavery was as huge an issue as it was in the United States with the Civil War and the North-South divide?
Well, I think part of it is numbers. There just weren't as many slaves. Slavery was part of the British Empire, and certainly, I'm not going to say that it wasn't
Right.
a major player within slavery, but the industry and the economy that was created in the United States because of the slave economy never took foot in Canada.
Yeah. It seems too that the Canadian government was a little bit more centralized early in its history, that they're allowed for federal programs to be pushed out easier. The British Empire was the one who actually passed the Slavery Abolition Act across the entire British Empire. So having the fallback of the British Empire versus the United States, which has that system of federalism, which would allow for states to still have the institution of slavery. So is there any information, how did your early schooling in secondary school focus on slavery at all in your history classes, Canadian history?
So it's impossible to do Canadian history without doing British and American history at the same time.
Right.
They're simply so ingrained and connected with each other. The history teacher I had mostly in high school certainly talked about Canadian slavery and talked about how it was different, especially in economic concerns. But it was yet another Canadian opportunity to say, those Americans, they're just, they're dirty slavers. So,
yeah, I mean, all right. So that transitions into my next point of topic. So it turns out in Canada, most of the active slaves were actually Indigenous Canadians rather than African Americans, which differed from American slavery. So in 2006, Amnesty International researched racism specific to Indigenous women in Canada. They report on the lack of basic human rights, discrimination, and violence against Indigenous women. Violence against First Nation women, aged 25 to 44, with status under the Indian Act, are 5 times more likely than other women of the same age to die as a result of violence. From 1928 to the mid-1990s, Indigenous girls in residential school systems were subject to forced sterilization once they reached puberty. The number of sterilized girls is not known because the records were destroyed. The number of Indigenous women and children gone missing or murdered within the next 10 years could reach 3,000. The issue of missing and Indigenous murdered women has been a great social issue that has received a deal of attention by the media, the Canadian government, and the United Nations Committee of the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. The estimate of missing and murdered women have ranged from 500 to 3,000 depending on the time period being studied and the method of calculating the statistic. The reason for the increased attention to this issue is the representation of murdered Indigenous women in crime statistics are not proportionate to the general population. And in 2008, Prime Minister Stephen Harper publicly issued an apology against the Indian Act. So the issue of Indigenous rights has come up a little bit more in Canadian politics with the Trudeau government's plan for pipelines that will impede on Indigenous lands. Do you have any thoughts on the Trudeau government's proposal in this aspect?
So a couple of things. One, this residential school system, in particular Indigenous women, First Nations women, has really come to a fore in the social consciousness of Canadians, I would say in the last 10 or 15 years. So since I left, it's not that those things weren't known about or didn't happen. It was that the kind of outrage of it began in the sort of last 10 and 15 years. And I would have to say that part of that is, I'm assuming part of that cultural change comes from Nunavut. So Nunavut's an Indigenous peoples, First Nation peoples province that is run by First Nation peoples. They own all the land and the mineral rights and the oil and gas rights. And so that sort of political power, I think, then allows for these stories to come out. In addition, a number of prominent Canadian entertainers took on this particular cause, including probably most famously Gord Downie from a band called Tragically Hip, who not only created a movie, a graphic novel, and an album about this situation, but spoke about it regularly, specifically to Trudeau. So,
yeah, and so we're talking about Trudeau, and with this being an ethnic studies project, I think it'd be remiss if we didn't bring up the elephant in the room, which was the photos that were released during the 2019 election cycle, featuring Trudeau in what appeared to be blackface. So politically, what do you think that the ramifications of this are? Do you think that Trudeau's government is worth re-electing for this? Or do you think that, shifting towards a more conservative or a more NDP-heavy government is the solution?
Well, first of all, you have to understand that Justin Trudeau is part of a political dynasty in Canada, and he really grew up at a similar time as I was growing up, and he was sort of a known teenager and known young person in Canada. It's kind of like a JFK Jr. kind of thing.
And for those who don't know, Trudeau's father was prime minister for a decade at least.
Over a decade. The majority of my young life, Trudeau's father was prime minister. So it kind of surprised me how it was kind of not bothered. It didn't bother the electorate in Canada, these particular brownface photos. But I think what saved Trudeau was he could show that he had matured and grown and learned not from that experience, but from other experience, in the sense that his cabinet is by far the most ethnically diverse cabinet that the country's ever had. He continually fights for the Indigenous rights and things like that. So I think Canadians were far more forgiving because he showed some education and showed some that he had learned some. That being said, the original question you asked me, I'm going to support more of an NDP government because I'm an NDP person, and I actually voted NDP in the last election because the the rules had changed and allowed me to vote in a federal election, though I didn't live in the country.
Alrighty, awesome. And one more thing that I think it's important to bring up in terms of the differences between Americans and Canadians on this issue was the 2019 leaders debate between all of the leaders for the coming election. It featured specific topics, and one of those, which they spent about half an hour talking about, was Indigenous people's rights. In our ethnic studies class, we talk a lot about how the Indigenous problem in the United States of America is largely based on lack of knowledge, and so I think bringing to this attention, people's attention to this in the leaders debate is really important for Canada.
Well, I totally agree. And again, I think that this is started and brought on by having Indigenous voices within the federal government in such a way that Nunavut brings to it. That, you know, they are not, they have full and equal membership within, as with other provinces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sovereignty is definitely key. Okay, so on to my next research topic. The Korematsu Maru incident involved the Japanese steamship Komaga Maru, on which a group of people from British India attempted to immigrate to Canada in 1914, but were denied entry and were forced to return to Calcutta, India. There, the Indian Imperial Police attempted an arrest on the group leader. A riot ensued, and they were fired upon by the police, resulting in death of 20 Sikhs. So I picked this issue so that we could talk about politically Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the New Democratic Party, who is actually Sikh. And so we can see that this happened in 1914, but already about a century later, Canada is getting more and more progressive in terms of a major party being led by a man with a turban who is under the Sikh faith. So do you have, obviously you're a supporter of the New Democratic Party, but do you have any specific opinions on Jagmeet Singh and his election in 2019?
Well, new voices and different voices are always fantastic. The woman who I voted for in the riding I used to live in Toronto was a young Japanese Canadian who was LGBTQ also. So I think that different voices are always going to create all sorts of good things in the conversation. The Sikh community in Canada has flourished, specifically in the Greater Toronto area, and I think has garnered nothing but loads of respect in all areas. The Minister of Defense under Trudeau is a Sikh, a very prominent businessman and Raptors fan in Toronto is a Sikh. There is a ginormous fan base for hockey in the Sikh community, including the show that has been running for almost 15 years in Canada, which is Hockey Night in Punjab, which is a Indian-based hockey report and game show. So I think that that's fantastic in the community. And I think that even more than the African Canadian community, the East Asian community in Canada was accepted long earlier in time. So.
Yeah. Just a little recap back from the 2019 election for those unaware. Singh's New Democratic Party lost 20 seats in the 2019 election, dropping from 44 to just 24 seats in the Canadian legislature. Do you think that his candidate shows like this brighter future? You were talking about, how Sikhs have been integrated into government, or do you think that the losses show that Canadians aren't quite ready to accept this newfound diversity that they have?
I actually think the loss of those seats has more to do with the division in parties between the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party, rather than a not are a weak NDP party. Yes, they lost 20 seats, and I would have liked them to actually gain 20 seats, but those numbers can change pretty rapidly. And the Conservative Party in Canada picked up steam specifically because of the strong Conservative base within Ontario, which, based on recent events, may turn again to a strong, more liberal base. So
Yeah, another thing that I would also point out for our listeners is a lot of the NDP's losses actually came from Quebec rather than Ontario, and a lot of them were resulting from the Bloc Québécois pickup of about the same number of seats. So it seems that a little bit of regional politics played into this issue as well.
yeah, and the Bloc always inhales and exhales, and what I mean by that is it does good in an election, and then the next election it will shrink again. It expands and shrinks and expands and shrinks.
All right, so we've been talking about some of these specific racial minorities, but there's some interesting information on the racial/religious minorities that make up Canada. So Jews make up a tiny part of Canada's religious makeup, representing less than Sikhism, which we talked about, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. But there has been some discrimination against them in the past, so I'd like to talk about that now.
You know, I really had no experience with anyone beyond Christianity or agnostic late into my teenage years. My friends and I went to see a documentary called Shoah, which is about the Holocaust. And we were asked by a number of people who were there if we were related to or part of the survivor community, because not only were there a number of survivor families there, but also actual survivors. And we said no, and we were welcomed with food and good cheer and good understanding. So that was kind of my first experience with that sort of faith outside my own or what I was raised in. Once I moved out of the sort of rural areas of Eastern Ontario to the cosmopolitan Western Ontario and Southwestern Ontario specifically, where I went to university and when I started working in Toronto, all of those things were around me and readily accepted in ways that I also felt, but I had known people to be ignorant to what those religions were in the past. But for instance, when I was working in the software industry in Toronto, there would be a 4:00 meeting for Islamic workers to go to do their prayer ceremony, and everybody knew what was going on, and everybody was fine with that. It was like, oh, where's this person? He's at the 4:00 meeting. And it wasn't like, oh, they're at the 4:00 meeting. It was more like that's what they're doing. So
That's great. I have a little passage to read, and then we can move on to our next thing. So Jewish students were prohibited from studying at Canadian universities. For a long time, Canada had restrictive policies towards Jewish immigration in 1939. Jewish refugees escaping from World War II, Europe, and across the MS St. Louis were not allowed to enter Canada due to racist immigration policies. The Canadian government recognized this systematic racism and made a formal apology in 2008. While government policies have changed, racism against Jews remains problematic. Hate crimes against Jews, also called violent anti-Semitism, is the highest per capita reported form of racism in Canada. This, despite Jews being a tiny minority of the population, only 1.2% of Canada's population in 2011. So moving right on, because you already answered my discussion questions before we even started, we're going to talk about the 1907 Vancouver riot. So the 1907 Vancouver riot was the second act of anti-Asian violence in the history of Vancouver. The first incident took place in the area of Cole Harbour in 1887. A riot targeting East Indian lumber workers in Bellingham in 1907 started these events. Shortly thereafter, tensions flared in the north and angry mobs stormed through Powell Street in Vancouver's Chinatown. breaking windows and assaulting Chinese peoples in the street. The riot lasted 3 days in September 1907. Finally, the Vancouver police closed the streets and calm slowly returned. Many windows were broken and the population was terrified. The second day of the riot turned against the Japanese community. There were similar actions in Stevenson, in Richmond against the Japanese, as various speakers were discussing the Bellingham riot. The sound of shattering glass caused by a rock tossed by an unruly teen had sounded the beginning of what would become a much larger riot in Vancouver. The crowd gathered at Paradise turned into a rioting mob, throwing beer bottles and rocks at windows, attempting to destroy Chinese-owned stores and homes. Most of the buildings attacked during the Vancouver riots were actually Caucasian-owned. The mob of rioters moved to Japantown after destroying Chinese businesses and homes. However, the riots were pushed back by Japanese residents. The Vancouver riot was not finished until 3 o'clock in the morning on September 8th. By the time dawn had broken in the city, it was quiet. The Vancouver race riot resulted in 0 casualties and a couple $1,000s worth of property damage. So growing up in a very white suburb, did you ever see any instances of racism growing up? But before you answer that, I want to preface this with a little description of your hometown, Carleton Place. And I think the best way to describe it is to go directly to the source of the People Urban Dictionary, which defines Carleton Place as a small country town in Ontario, sandwiched between Altmony, Smith Falls, and Ottawa. Probably the most racist, homophobic town, no variety, just white, Catholic, rich conservative folks. The teenagers are all druggies, and the adults are all losers who never made it out of the small town. At least they had tailgating parties. So, have you ever experienced any forms of racism in your very uniformly ethnically white town?
So Carleton Place is very white. I absolutely admit that. It's not as bad as that description had said.
It's a little hyperbolic.
It's a little hyperbolic, but I'll give you 2 examples. So the first real racism that I saw, like understood and felt happening was when I was in the 7th grade. So this would be 1982 or 3. I'm not sure of the exact year. So early 1980s in Canada, where there was an influx at that point in time of Vietnamese refugees. It's no surprise that after the Vietnamese War had ended and the North Vietnam had taken over the country, that there were a number of refugees. A lot of them came to Canada. And there was a particular student who came to Canada. I thought he was fine. He was another student to me. Mm-hmm. But I did notice him being bullied by older students, grade 8s especially. And there were racial overtones to that bullying that I had never seen before. And I remember it being upsetting to me and me comforting that person. Mm-hmm. And I hope that he's doing great. And
hopefully he moved out of Carleton Place.
He and I don't think he went to our high school, so he must have. He went to, I spoke to him about how awful it had been in Vietnam, I remember. And he said over and over again how much better Canada was than where he was living, though he found it very cold.
Yeah. Yes.
And then the second thing I want to talk about is the second real people of color interaction that I had, which was in high school. In the town I lived in, Carleton Place, there was a Indian family, a East Indian family. Now, the father was a successful businessman, and there was a younger brother and an older sister, and they were absolutely accepted into the high school community, so much so I think the younger brother was student president at one point in time. The older sister was very popular, and the brother, the son, played on the basketball teams, and there was no sort of separation with that family. So I think, like I said earlier, that East Indian population was accepted a little bit more. Now, that is to say, I never went to school with a black person. I never actually spoke face to face with an African American or African Canadian until I went to college.
All right, so now for possibly the most unique form of xenophobia and racism is Quebec bashing and the English-French tensions between the regions of Ontario and Quebec. So I researched a specific example that I thought was interesting. So the Richard riot was a riot on March 17th, 1955 in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. This riot was named after Maurice Richard, the star ice hockey player for the Montreal Canadiens of the National Hockey League. Following a violent altercation on March 13th, when Richard hit a linesman, which is a referee in hockey, NHL President Clarence Campbell suspended him for the remainder of the 1954-55 NHL season, including the playoffs. Montreal fans protested this suspension as too severe. The team's largely francophone fan base claimed the length of the suspension was motivated by Richard's French-Canadian ethnicity. Outside of Montreal, however, the suspension was seen as justified and, if anything, too short. On March 17th, Campbell appeared at the Montreal Forum for the Canadiens' first game after Richard's suspension. His presence provoked a riot at the Forum that spilled into the streets. The riot caused an estimated $100,000 in property damage, 37 injuries, and 100 arrests. Tension eased after Richard made a personal plea, accepting his punishment and promising to return the following year to help win the team a Stanley Cup. The incident likely cost Richard the 1954-55 scoring title and played a role in the off-season departure of longtime Canadiens head coach Dick Irving. So I know that you know a couple people who live in the Quebec and Montreal area now. So did you see those rivalries between French-speaking and English-speaking Canadians while you lived in Canada?
So it's impossible to separate hockey from French and English relations. Mm-hmm. It's nearly impossible to remove anything in Canadian society from English and French rivalries. They go back so far into the basic formation of the country, back to Upper Canada and Lower Canada days. That being said, I think, again, things like mandatory English and French classes in school certainly had an effect on me of making it less of an other and more of a us. Mm-hmm. And so I never had that sort of anti-Francophone bias, but it was certainly there. And I heard lots of people say things like frogs and use slurs to French people, especially because I lived very close. We were only 40 minutes from Ottawa, which is right on the border with Hull, Quebec.
Right.
So we were able to go to Quebec fairly easily. I know that out west in Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba, there is also a strong anti-French bias out there as well.
Yeah, I think that you were talking about this sort of rivalry between the English and French-speaking Canadians has been turned a little bit more friendly over the years. You hail from the Toronto area, and we are both Toronto Maple Leafs fans, so we have I would say, friendly rivalry with the Montreal Canadiens team. And also another thing I would like to point
I dislike the Montreal Canadiens because they're the Montreal Canadiens, not because they're French.
I'd also like to point out that this isn't even the only example of massive hockey-related riots in Canadian history, when in 2011 riots broke out in Vancouver when the Canucks lost Game 7 to possibly the only team you hate more than the Montreal Canadiens, the Boston Bruins, and caused more than $5 million Canadian dollars in property damage, which is possibly the most Canadian thing that I've ever heard.
Really dislike the Bruins.
Yeah. All right. So we finished with the research portion of this. So I'm gonna open it up to like two more broad questions, and then we're gonna wrap it up. So how do you think that you've seen racism differ in America versus your roots in Canada?
The systematic and structural racism that is complete in the United States is stunning to me still. When you have things like ID laws being passed in southern states that are, to me, clear indications of attempts to do things like poll taxes or
They're ready admissions of racism.
Yeah, they're ready admissions of racism. I've never been around casual racists as much as I have been in the United States. Certainly, we live in a conservative state, and it's not to say that if you're conservative, you're racist, but I have been kind of stunned things I've actually heard people say in Indiana, just as an aside, that I would have never heard in Canada or never thought of in Canada. So that sort of almost casual racism it still takes me back. Like I'm just stunned by it.
Yeah, I'd say too that I really liked your point of how systematic racism is in the U.S. You know, we never really saw things like redlining, and of course there was some racialized laws, but nothing compared to the Jim Crow era post Civil War in the United States. So I think I agree with you. I think that's the key element that separates the racism in Canadian versus U.S., where it's more social in Canada and more structural, which sort of pervades across the society in the U.S.
Yeah, we never saw, I never saw a water fountain in Canada that said for blacks only or whites only. They may have existed. I don't think it was in any way structuralized like that. Mm-hmm. There's the racism in Canada is far more subtle and far more interpersonal, I would say.
Mm-hmm. So finally, how do you think that we can take the lessons from Canadian racism and American racism that we talked about today and use them to make both countries better? But obviously, America is the one that needs a little bit more work. So how do you think we can apply the lessons that you learned in Canadian government and apply them to American government, or even just, volunteering and working with people outside of government to reduce the structural and social racism in the U.S.?
So Jean Chrétien was a liberal prime minister for a number of years, and early in the 1990s, he basically opened up the country and to allow gay marriage and things like that. I'm pretty sure it was Jean Chrétien who did that. And why he said, when asked why he did that, is because he said government is to protect the people who can't protect themselves. And that attitude is not prevalent in terms of understanding or believing in what the government's role is in American society.
Yeah.
And I would think that maybe some thinking along that lines, that government's role is to help protect the people who can't protect themselves, may aid in that. In terms of the other way around of American systems helping Canadian systems, I think that the regionalism in Canada and the way the parliamentary system is abused by that regionalism might be helped by a more American system of elections. But it is impossible to think about elections in Canada without thinking about the West, Ontario, and Quebec. And that kind of leaves the East and places like BC out to dry.
That's interesting. So you think that like a more parliamentary system is more open to being abused by racists because of that?
Well, the Canadian population centers really is a country of empty space, and a country where 85% now, I think, of the people live within 90 miles of the U.S. border. So that sort of consolidation of people allow it to take over and force government. Like the election goes, however Quebec and Ontario go.
Yeah. All right. And so another thing that I would bring up that I think I'd like to see more of in Canadian politics is I think we've seen this really huge social movement in America that's sort of divorced from politics in terms of Black Lives Matter protests and those kinds of things that we've seen in a lot lesser amounts in Canada. And feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but Americans, I think because of their constitutional spirit, are more inclined to protest, to turn out in big numbers to protests and like civic demonstrations and voice their opinions there rather than elections. The election turnout in Canada is actually usually a little higher than American election turnout, but I would say that outside of that, that's something that Canada could use.
Yep, I could agree with that.
Alrighty, and so I think that will wrap up our first and only episode of this podcast. So I would like to thank you for joining me, Mr. Bell.
And thank you for all the thoughtful questions.
Alrighty, thank you very much, and please give me an A, Mr. Buckenfeld.